Chapter 421, Doing Something. Chris' point of view. The siege began just as the 3-hour timer finished. The trebuchets were wheeled into range, and when the time was up, all 30 of them were fired in unison. The boulders soared through the air toward the walls as shields and spells rose to meet them. 3 stones were broken by large spells sent to meet them, 2 more by arrows launched by powerful bows, and 12 broke upon impact with a layer of mana shields. 13 rained down upon the wall, and its formations flared as they impacted with resounding thuds. Glowing lines filled with mana curled up and down the stone blocks, and I strained my perception to make out what runes that had been used. There were many more than I could tell. Obvious ones like runes of protection, durability, and hardness were easy to spot, but others weren't so easily noticeable. Earth runes of some sort, I guessed, but I wasn't sure what type exactly. Were they plain earth runes, or were they stone runes? Just as ice, frost, and snow were each different runes, earth had similar delineations. From how far away we still were, I wasn't able to get much more than that. If my perception were higher or my mana senses greater, that wouldn't be the case, but things were as they were. A few moments later, the weapons unloaded again, and again, and again. Earth was brought up from the depths, compacted, saturated in mana and law, before being sent flying toward the walls, but moments later. The process was swift and practiced, much like I'd seen in East Fort. It made me wonder how much practice the crews had gotten while in Gemini. While I stood and watched the siege begin, I wasn't quite sure what to do. Usually, at this time, I would be charging into combat or swinging my hammer around in battle, but that wasn't the case this time. There wasn't anything for me to do exactly. With my strength, I could certainly launch my own projectiles of ice, but what use would that be? Nothing I could throw would amount to much compared to what we were already doing. Instead, I figured I may as well use Tundra's Descent. My mana was already full, and not using it felt like a waste. While my acumen was low, I could still channel whatever regeneration I got into the skill. The trickle of mana that fed the skill matrix was small, but a cool wind began to stir around me. It did little to offset the warm spring air, but it was better than doing nothing. With it being the eve of summer, I would have to leverage a lot more mana if I wanted to change it more drastically. Soon, my cold wind was joined by others. I looked around and could feel the chill emanating from a large portion of the Oathbound. Ice and frost and snow, tundra and glacier, blizzard and rime, mana of all frozen varieties. The host of men and women chilled the area with their very presence. The mana that escaped them naturally. Now that mana was being leveraged into skills, just as I had begun to do. The chill grew deeper, but it still wasn't enough to overcome nature. Watching us collectively assert our will on nature stirred something, but I wasn't sure what. The feeling struck a memory, but it was hard to recall when. An image flashed in my head of fighting a legion of orcs before I finally remembered. It had felt too soon then. Now it felt right, but like something different was missing. I reached deeper, trying to figure out what it all meant, but the feeling vanished. Like I had tried to force my anchor into reality. Fuck. I knew advancing my spirit was going to be difficult, but it was still frustrating. It didn't help that I felt no resonance. My spirit hadn't responded at all to anything. Instead, it had lain dormant in its tattered state. Another annoyance. Chris? Abigail broke me out of my musings. Gabriel has an idea. Annoyed, I turned away from the walls. What is it? He wants to use you as an anchor for a ritual. He's called everyone with a cold affinity to participate. She answered. What? My brows scrunched in confusion. Abigail shrugged. Ask him. It's his research. Over the years, Gabriel had studied spells and their matrices more and more. While I had been in the far north, he'd been researching. While I had been forging to get a better evolution, he had been studying. Outside of Abigail, he was Volwyn's most frequent customer, buying anything he could afford and get his hands on regarding spells and the way they worked. Miles was a close third. Finding my brother wasn't all that hard, as he was at the center of the largest concentration of people in the camp. Surrounding him were his lieutenants, Jax, Meredith, Bailey, and Sean. They were discussing something animatedly while everyone else looked on from around them. Seeing me, they parted to let me through. Won't be strong enough. The efficiency will be terrible if it ends up working in the first place, Jack said. Like your idea's all that much better, Bailey scoffed. You come up with a better way to link hundreds of people ritually without frying everyone's mana channels. Whatever Jax was going to respond with died when he saw me. The others who were arguing turned as well. What are you guys arguing about? I asked. Gabriel cleared his throat. I'm sure you can tell that our passive regeneration isn't enough to overwhelm nature. I nodded as that much was obvious. Well, I think there's a way to change that, he said before quickly launching into an explanation. A person on their own naturally leaks mana when their mana pools are full. It happens without conscious effort, and whatever affinity mana they have is released into the environment. On its own, and being only one person, the amount of mana is so minuscule compared to the ambient mana that it doesn't do anything. Those with stronger affinities, more intelligence, and higher acumen release more mana and of a higher concentration, but that still can't sway how much mana is in an area. It's like a drop in the bucket. But that can be changed with skills. Skills like your Tundra's Descent, or Blizzard, or any other area affecting skill use that mana more efficiently. Instead of just releasing it into the area, it amplifies it with a spell matrix. If you were to dump your entire mana pool in one spot, and in another pour all of it into Tundra's Descent, it would result in two very different outcomes. I understand that. I nodded along. Yes, but all of that is on the individual scale. Gabriel's eyes were lively as he described it. Group a large amount of people together like we have here and the effects are additive. One person's change adds to another person's change. I proposed that if we were to link them all together, the change would be multiplicative. Like how artillery spells have to be cast ritually by linking mages together. Similar to how the efficiency of the change is amplified when using spells, this would amplify it once more. That all makes sense, I said. Then what were all of you arguing about? Gabriel's face lost some of its liveliness. The how is where we conflict. Not everyone has ritual casting, and even if they do, they're not all skilled in using it. We're trying to come up with the most efficient and safest way to do this without, as Bailey put it, fry everyone's mana channels. It sounds like a formation. Of course, I'd thought about creating such a thing, but it would be so expensive and time-consuming it wouldn't be worth it in the end. When I created my frost areas before, they had never been on a city-size scale. The city itself spanned a large area, but to set up something like that would have to be done outside the range of its weapons, adding thousands of square feet to the project. Not only that, but I wouldn't be able to add any runes or mana pathways on the inside of the city, which wasn't something I could accomplish. With those limitations, I discarded the idea not long after thinking of it. It was possible, probably, but not my hand. Every formation I created started in the center and worked its way out. Now, Gabriel had suggested a way around those limitations by using a ritual and people instead of runes and formations. You would know better than I would. Tell me what you need me to do, I said. Whoever is used to anchor the ritual, should it fail, would feel the brunt of the backlash. You have the strongest body here and the highest resistance to the energies involved, so I figured you're the best choice. Your strong affinity helps too, he explained. Abigail, who'd followed me, spoke. This sounds dangerous, Gabe. Gabe scoffed. No more dangerous than charging into battle. I trust you. I nodded. Do what you need to. Gabriel got excited and began working out the specifics with the rest of his order. Eventually, the plan had been whittled down from its more lofty ideals. Instead of linking everyone with a cold affinity, it would only be a portion. When mages started to tire from holding the ritual together, they would be cycled out. Plus, instead of only using everyone's natural regeneration, it would drain more than what was regenerated. When someone reached 3/4, they would cycle out for someone who had a full mana pool. All in all, the mages of the Fox Order argued, discussed, and refined ideas for a few hours before they came up with something they were all satisfied with. After that began the process of setting it all up. Groups were segregated and the links were all planned out. The least skilled ritual casters were at the bottom, linked to a half dozen or so non-mages, while they themselves were grouped with others on their level. A stronger mage linked together than the group before being grouped together themselves. Gabriel had referenced military structure when coming up with the linking process, but it was more like a pyramid scheme by the way I looked at it. Still, the links grew in size, and at the top of it all were Gabriel, Meredith, and Bailey, all of whom were a variation of Cryomancer. Jax was an earth mage, and Sean was a wind mage. "Are you ready?" Gabriel asked, straining already at his great work. "As ready as I can be," I said, prepared. I wasn't sure what it would feel like, as I had never done anything like this, but I felt it as soon as I was pulled in. Links of mana from the three mages wrapped around me, and a strong weight settled on my shoulders. I could have blocked it if I'd wanted to, which gave me a bit of peace of mind. Then I thought of what would happen if I suddenly broke that connection. It would no doubt hit Gabriel with the backlash, along with Meredith and Bailey. Don't do that then. Along with the weight, there was a different kind of strain on my mana channels. It was odd to describe, but it wasn't exactly pleasant. Instead of a physical pain or weight, it was an arcane one. "The links are complete. Are you ready to begin?" Gabriel asked. I nodded. Mana rushed into me in quantities I'd never felt before. Ice, frost, snow, all of it jumbled together in my body. Some of it was tainted with other mana, like tundra being earthy and snow being watery, but all of it had enough commonality that it didn't begin raging inside my body. That didn't mean it was peaceful, but it was bearable. I grunted at the force of it all, but it wasn't as bad as I feared. It felt like being under the effects of a maxed weight of the Arctic, fury, and glacial presence. My boosting skills put a similar strain on me that this ritual did, which I hadn't anticipated. That being the case, my new copper body was specifically prepared to handle loads such as this. While the strain wasn't bad, the mana was. There was just too much of it. My magical stats were fractions of what my physical ones were, and I'd never dealt with as much mana as this. Felt like my body was trying to refine itself. Mana saturated every pore, and when my cells began to break down, it built back with some of the mana. I was about to call on my bloodline, but the pressure eased. The mana that had been building inside me cycled back out of me and into Gabriel, Meredith, and Bailey. They were much better prepared to handle it than I was, and 3 massive spell circles bloomed into existence. 3 ethereal tails fluttered behind Gabriel as he forged the mana into what he needed it to be. Meredith's Actic Wolf bloodline was also being used, while Bailey's Orlin bloodline turned her skin blue, with white lines dancing across her skin. Orluns were a race of ice spirits, similar to that of naiads. Whatever cool breeze I'd been feeling earlier was blown away as it felt like I'd ripped open a frozen rift 3 times around me. Temperatures plunged, and snow began to fall from the sky. "Ha!" Gabriel laughed. "I knew it!" His eyes scanned an invisible screen, and I knew it was a spell upgrade of some kind. Meredith and Bailey did the same. They explored their upgrades while maintaining their spells, while I focused on something different. The ritual links connecting out of me looked and felt eerily familiar. I closed my eyes and felt for another link that was constantly there, outside of the ritual. Frostguard Oathbound was doing something. It felt like it was helping, stabilizing the ritual, but I wasn't sure how. I'd have to ask Gabriel about it. "I wonder if there's a way to reinforce a spell structure?" Gabriel muttered, looking at the spell circle in front of him. Now didn't feel like the time to ask him about it. Instead, I turned back to Smoothrock's walls and watched the snow begin to fall over the city, and everywhere around it. A loud snap sent more boulders flying, and I saw those land, too. Now, at least it felt like I was doing something as the snow accumulated. Waiting a few days like this didn't sound all that bad now. But I'd be ready to charge the walls when the time came, and I hoped it would be soon. Chapter 422 Victory or Death. Chris' point of view. Location: Siege of Smoothrock. My forging hammer slammed down, and lines of mana spread across the boulder's surface, completing the very temporary and ramshackle enchantment. "Try this one," I said after sweeping it with my skills and mana sense. It wouldn't last long, but then again it didn't need to. "Loading!" Jax shouted the notice for everyone to get out of the way. Moments later, the boulder lifted off the ground and slotted into the sling pocket of the trebuchet. Once it stopped moving, he turned to me and nodded. "Fire?" I said, noting how quickly the enchantment was losing cohesion without something to bind it. The crew pulled the pin holding the counterweight in place, and the arm snapped forward, launching the payload into the air. I tried to keep track of how the enchantment fared with my mana senses, but it moved out of range too fast. Still, I strained my eyes and watched as it landed. I'd been at this for a while, so I knew where to look and its expected trajectory. The loud crash it elicited when it landed followed right after the bright flash and explosion of stone, dust, and shrapnel. A few stone blocks of the wall toppled down into the snowy ground, and a large crack widened from the impact. After days of bombarding the city, the walls were beginning to crumble. Snow had accumulated as well, up to my knees nearly. Those with better eyesight had reported the guards along the walls bundled up in thick blankets, never far from a fire. The momentum rune is good, but the boulder broke apart too easily. Too much force is getting lost in its own destruction instead of being transferred to the wall, Hal commented from the side. His eyes were much better than mine, and he had been brought in to report how well each test went. So far, hardness and durability runes had the best results. Impact runes and momentum runes, as he stated, lost force when the stone making up the boulder failed. "Can't you make them any harder, Jax?" That's good. That was becoming the hard constraint of my tests. An annoying one as well. The mage stared at me hard with a bit of sweat running down his face, even in the cold. "I'm doing my best. I'm already pouring everything I have into them, but my law isn't made for stability. If you want that, get the wall over here." The wall he was referring to was John, but he had other things to attend to, sadly. "I wish I could use my spirit. That would work perfectly," I muttered, upset. It would be the perfect way to add hardness and durability, but I couldn't. It was why this was so annoying. The solution was just out of reach. I could still use spiritual energy, but doing so hurt and had a chance of exacerbating my wound. It wasn't worth it just for this. I walked over to the next prepared boulder and used runecrafting and mana engraving. The combined skills hastened the usually lengthy process of carving runes at the cost of quality and longevity. Instead of etching them nicely with rune carving and filling them with mana-conductive infill, my mana acted as the structure, power source, and glue holding it all together. Each boulder took a large chunk of mana to engrave, and even more to keep it stable for the brief moments it needed to be. This time I flipped through Rune Repository, looking for anything else that might work. I'd already tried making the boulder as hard as possible, and my next attempt was on amplifying the momentum. Runes filled my mind as I dismissed them one after another. Elemental runes like fire and frost weren't helpful. Wind might make it move faster, but not enough to matter. Weight might work. Invert a weight reduction enchantment? That just achieves a denser boulder, though. We'd have to readjust the aim, increase the counterweight, and ensure the wood won't break. Too much work. Picturing various runes, an image of my hammer surfaced. Along its surface, a string of runes glowed with power, and I knew instinctually what the runes did. They glowed every time I used Shattering Hammer. It had been hard to decipher at first, as the runes were in a different language than what I was used to, but Volwyn had helped in that regard. Most runes I knew were from human lands, and the books I read were from a standardized format that most enlightened races used. The ones along my hammer weren't. They were from the old language of the frost giants, and they were the same runes my heart used when I'd formed it. It had been difficult to decipher at first, but time wore down even the most obscure of them as I kept at it. Shattering Hammer used runes of rending, shattering, and sundering. Obvious in hindsight, but in learning them, they were added to Rune Repository. I'd never tried enchanting them, though. Runes usually enhanced or augmented whatever you put them on, but that wasn't the case for my hammer. Shattering Hammer shattered whatever I hit, not the weapon itself. There was some overlap as my hammer changed when I used the skill, but most of it was transferred to my target. I could do the same now. Transfer the effect to the wall instead of the boulder itself shattering. A boulder wasn't a hammer, and I didn't have anywhere near the skill of whoever created my weapon, but it didn't need to be perfect. It just had to last a few seconds, and it didn't need to be pretty. My mana surged into my forging hammer as I brought it down. The runes were hard and fought me, but I hammered down again and again. The structure of the enchantment was even more unstable than the others, and consumed mana at a voracious rate to keep from tearing itself apart. I fed it some of the mana coursing through me from the ritual, as my mana pool wasn't nearly enough to sustain it. Every hit spread the runic lines further, as pathways curved and twirled into the right shape. The old language was rigid and angular, whereas the standardized one had more flow and curves. The difference nearly cost me, but I fixed it in time. With the last line in place, I hurriedly called out, "Now, Jax, hurry!" Hearing the rush in my tone, he lifted the stone much faster than the previous one and with a lot less grace, but it slotted into the sling all the same. "Fire!" I called. The arm snapped forward. Hal and Jax looked on curiously as they both knew this one was different. When the stone impacted the wall, it didn't just crumble into pieces, but exploded into dust from the force. I suspected part of that was the enchantment's work, but I couldn't be sure. At first, I feared failure, but the rumbling didn't stop after the stone's implosion. Continued. The cracked wall started to shift as piece after piece fell off into the snow. Finally, something critical was lost, as an entire portion began to tilt back and begin to fall. I watched with bated breath as a section of wall nearly a dozen feet wide collapsed completely. Hal and Jax were both stunned speechless. A chime rang in my head. "Congratulations! You have leveled up. Congratulations! You have leveled up. You have upgraded a skill. Runesmithing, uncommon, runesmithing, rare. You have upgraded a skill. Mana engraving, uncommon, mana engraving, rare. 2 levels? I wondered. Then I felt the essence rush in, confirming it. The skill upgrades were nice, but there was something much more pressing on my mind right now. We'd been at this for days, and right now was the best time we had to attack the city before they could patch what we'd just broken. The broken section could be one entry point, while I would forge another. It wasn't as many as I hoped, but it would do. I pulled the horn from my belt and blew it loud and long. Instantly, the entire camp sprang into motion. People ran to their tents to grab armor and weapons, while others started setting out supplies. Mana potions for mages and healers. Health potions for warriors. With everyone kicked into motion, I paced over to my personal tent and grabbed my armor off the stand in the corner. It was, once again, a new set after I ruined my old one. The plate had gotten too thin after repairing it the last time and needed to be replaced. Chest piece, leg plate, greaves, heavy-plated skirt, and pauldron's last were fastened down quickly. My helmet slid on to complete the look before I traded out my forging hammer for a hammer of war. The last thing I did before leaving my tent was pick up a thick slab of frosted metal with my left hand. The shield was crude, but it would serve its purpose. I could discard it once I breached the walls and the fun began. As I stepped out of my tent, ice condensed around me, glacial heavy plate, adding a second layer of protection. I felt the river of gushing mana that had worn on my body for days finally cease, as Gabriel must have cut the ritual. Before, I'd feared it would be difficult to halt the working, but with days to come up with a solution, his brilliant mind had easily done so with time to spare. Shelving that thought, I ran through my supplies and double-checked my armor. In a pouch protected behind my backplate was a stamina potion and a health potion, a precaution now that my endurance and durability weren't quite as endless as they used to be. Mana's at 3/4, but it's more than enough. Tundra's Descent wouldn't need all that much, and other than Frozen Rift, my other skills didn't use that much. Ranks had formed while I'd gotten ready, and now everyone looked ready for war. Light furs and thin cloth had been traded for plates of gleaming metal and thick hides. Cloaks had been removed, and weapons and shields had been strapped on. Every warrior in the first 5 rows had a shield hefted and ready. I strode to the front with measured steps and saw Elliot, Anders, and Ashton ready and waiting. "Took you long enough," Elliot ribbed. "Not all of us can cheat like you." I smiled, appreciating the levity. Pre-battle nerves were starting to rise, and short jabs helped keep them at bay. Putting on my armor was quick, but I would never beat someone who could shift into it at will. I turned toward the thousands standing at the ready. This wasn't the first time most had followed me into war, but it would be for some. I wasn't quite sure what to say. These speeches were never my forte, and we needed to be quick. I said the only thing that came to mind. Victory or death are the only outcomes we all face today. When this battle is over, we will either stand valiant and victorious, or we will die gloriously. It is up to you to determine which fortune yours will be. No one, not even gods, can determine that for you. My aura amplified my words, and I didn't wait for them to settle in. I turned and positioned myself at the front of the spear. Everyone knew what to do. The plan had been set for days, and there was no need to change it now. Elliot, the master of the Bear Order, would lead a third of our forces through the hole in the city's walls. Anders, Ashton, and Hugo would lead a third in pushing a tower into place. Anders had given his word that he was enough to accomplish the task without my help, while I led the last third up and over. With the amount of snow that had fallen, creating a ramp of ice was well within my skill set. Close to the wall would be tricky. The formation enchanted on the walls disrupted manipulation magic, and if I got close enough, that would extend to any ramp I tried to make. But if I made it high enough, jumping wasn't out of the question. It would leave me and everyone who followed behind me without a path of retreat, but that was fine. Forward was the only direction I planned on moving. I was just about to call for the charge when the combined voices of thousands reverberated from behind me. It echoed in my bones and surrounded me in conviction. Victory or death. Chapter 423, Impact. Crisp point of view. My heart pounded as I commanded the charge forward with my shield raised. The city hadn't sat by and watched as we amassed our forces, and as soon as the section of wall fell, bells began to ring throughout the city. Soldier after soldier appeared atop the wall in haphazard ranks, strapping on their armor as they hastened to their position. Some even had thick blankets wrapped around them to ward off the cold. Their bowmen's hands shook as bows were passed out and arrows were drawn. The breath of thousands puffed into small clouds in lines. Tundra's descent wasn't even needed, but I activated the skill anyway and leaned into it with my laws. It was already colder than I could leverage my mana to get it, but I could still enhance it with my law. It made it much harder to ward off with skills when facing laws. My first steps toward the wall lengthened, as I called on my bloodline and grew. My new body of copper drank in that energy ravenously, shifting and changing not only quicker, but more exaggerated. The Jotun bloodline caused my skin to shift into a pale blue, my hair to turn stark white, and my eyes to blaze with a piercing, icy blue light. The cosmetic changes paled in comparison to the rest. My body grew over 3 feet, my muscles increased in size and density, and my bones became as hard as glaciers. My steps thundered with the additional weight, and my gait lengthened to match my increased size. Even without the highest agility, I began to outpace those behind me, my height and strength propelling me faster than they could keep up with. My hammer, bound in ways I was just beginning to understand, grew to match my new stature, becoming a true behemoth of a weapon. My charge picked up pace as I ran through the flimsy wooden stakes and hidden traps with ease. They weren't even enough to get through my ice, let alone harm my body. The piddly arrows shot by hasty and rushed bowmen did even worse. The inexperience in smooth rock was showing. A concentrated volley was always better than isolated shots, but then again, I doubt the dozen or so arrows had been ordered in the first place. When I stepped into range, the mages were the first real resistance that we met. Which was funny that it was also the only type that I didn't have to do anything to block. Thick mana shields bloomed over our charge, and the most prominent one, in a nice ocean blue, appeared directly above me. The shield covered dozens of feet and nearly 100 warriors, and I doubted it took Abigail all that much effort. That was where mages excelled, and while she hadn't marched with us in the previous battles, she still showed why she was one of the strongest mages in Frostheim. That was if her core wasn't already enough. Like Vanessa and Zuri, Abigail had forged 2 circles around her already powerful mana core. The shield rippled under the impact, but held. A few on either side of the line cracked, but none of the spells managed to get through. Traps exploded under my feet to the same effectiveness as the spells, Except this time, my armor was the one to blunt the attacks. Others weren't as lucky, but the Oathbound were strong. The impacts weren't enough to kill outright, but a few did lose limbs because of it. I trusted in the healers to get to them quickly. As our unified charge began to split into three, it was Ashton, Anders, and Hugo who drew a large amount of attention as they wheeled the tower towards the wall, but Gabriel and Meredith inside the tower were more than enough to shield against everything that came their way. Elliot faced his own troubles, along with Avery, who followed behind him, but they charged toward the gap valiantly. Surprisingly, I didn't face all that many attacks. There were a few catapult shots that landed near, but none hit me. A few behind me had to dodge out of the way, but I was left free to run unhindered, which was a mistake. They probably thought we didn't stand a chance of getting through the wall. Elliot, who was charging toward the gap, and Anders, who was pushing the tower into place, were much more obvious priorities than the person charging headlong into a solid length of wall. I called on the ice around me, and it answered freely. Ice manipulation, enhanced by my bloodline, had the snow leaping to obey, and obey it did. The path in front of me began to slope upward as snow solidified into a ramp. My steps sank into it at first, but I condensed the loose flakes into ice, which held my weight much better. It was more mana-intensive, but necessary. It also didn't help my mana that I had to make it 24 feet wide. When the defenders saw what I was doing, I quickly became the centerpiece of their attention. I had gone from the lowest priority target to the highest, and not only that, but also the closest. A large spell circle bloomed in front of one mage, and the amount of mana he was working with was large. Water condensed further and further, as the spell gained power and grew more concentrated. He lifted his staff only for the water to collapse, falling to the ground. An arrow had pierced through his chest, leaving a hole thicker than my wrist. I wasn't sure if I should thank Hal or Sydney for the help, but I was appreciative all the same. My steps were swift, and easily put me ahead of our other two branches of attack. The ramp built and built, taking more of my energy and attention. Not only did I have to continually manipulate and shape where I was about to step, but keep what was behind me intact for those who came after. I nearly failed. Nearly. My spirit, the energy that I'd used in nearly every fight, was missing, and in its absence I faltered. I expected my ice to be stronger than it was. I expected it to be more resilient. It wasn't. When a catapult landed and broke apart what I had been building, I nearly fell then and there. My steps slid to a halt that nearly pulled me over the edge and down, and the only reason I held on was my instinct to reach out with my aura and grab hold of whatever I could. Like the instinct that came when you teetered a chair too far and started to fall. Bigger. It needs to be bigger. If the ice was weaker than normal, then it needed to be thicker. More of it so that it could withstand what I needed it to. Arrows pinged off my shield as I fixed what was broken. My gate had been broken, leaving me stationary for too long without reprisal. My shield held under the assault as I reforged the path in front of me. Layer upon layer of ice rose from the ground, and I restarted my charge toward the walls. Higher and higher I pushed it. Higher and higher I needed it to go. The walls were tall, taller than they appeared from the ground. Getting over them was going to be a challenge, but it was a challenge I had set out upon. I wouldn't fail now. If I failed, those behind me would be sitting ducks. We needed to keep moving. Stopping meant death. As I'd said the words before, the only one to keep that from happening was myself. I strained ice manipulation to the limits. My range was larger than 50 feet, but the distance caused my strength to wane. Manipulation from further away was like trying to force 10 gallons of water through a tiny straw. Without my bloodline, I wouldn't have managed it. Without its aid, I would have failed. The ice continued to rise into the air until I could see the walls no more. Its angle was too sharp, and the wall below its horizon. I'd honestly expected to face more resistance. I'd expected for someone to try something, but no one did. 25 feet from the wall, my concentration snapped. Not just snapped, but was shattered. I felt my mana brush up against the formation and get eviscerated. The full force of the formation wasn't something I could withstand. Not when I was spread so thin in creating what I was. My charge was quickly running out of runway. I could push the ramp no further or get any closer. I hope this is enough. As my foot reached the edge, I leapt. Charge and dash activated at the same time. I was usually so grounded when I fought. Steady and sturdy in my movements. Planted. Rooted. Now I was flying through the air with the wind whipping by. I had half a mind to part the wind before me with wind manipulation, but I saw that it wouldn't be needed. My leap was longer than I hoped, my strength greater, and the effects of charge and dash more effective. The distance between me and the wall closed rapidly. I saw the soldiers atop it staring at me with varied looks. Some looked at me as if they would a madman. Some saw my large form and heavy hammer and showed fear. A natural reaction I could only suspect. It was one I was regretfully getting used to. Some of those who showed fear froze. It was those who showed fear but did not that drew my attention. They powered through the fear and raised their weapons anyway. Bows up and down the wall were all pointed in one direction. At me. I couldn't see anything else after I raised my shield and braced. The large slab had reached my knees before, and now it felt so small in my hands. Still, I held it in front of my flight and hoped it would hold. That the runes would hold. I had forged them myself, but there were still doubts. The force of the impacts slowed my leap, but they weren't enough to stop it. I had too much weight and momentum to stop like that, but it still hurt. My arm ached as the defenders threw everything they could at me. My vision blocked by the shield, it was over before I knew it. The stone ramparts came up and hit me. The fall wasn't high, but the unexpected landing hadn't given me time to brace. Graceful went out the window, and instead, I came in tumbling. In moments, I was back on my feet to see the confused faces of everyone on the wall. They hadn't expected me to jump over it, and weren't sure whether to draw swords or knock another arrow. Attack! Draw dash! A man dressed in better armor tried to rally the defenders, but I wasn't about to let that happen. With a small spin for speed, I threw my shield as hard as I could. The heavy slab of metal spun through the air like a frisbee, but it hit with nothing short of a full blow from my hammer. Blood sprayed out as the man choked on his orders, and the top half of his body slid off from the bottom. The shield, now painted red, continued reaping 2 or 3 more before embedding itself into a tower. Both hands free, I ripped my hammer around in a wide arc that pulverized everyone within range. The ramparts were turned red as dozens of people died. I heard thuds from behind me. Valerie and Cole, the 2 lieutenants who had followed behind me. Cole, Val, go right. I'll go left, I ordered gruffly. The woman hefted her large sword and fell into step on Cole's right. His shield and mace had a shorter reach than Valerie's great sword, so he stuck closer to the ramparts to give her room. I charged left while Cole and Val cleared the right. Our foothold was gained through blood, and more thuds impacted with every step. With each, our numbers grew and we pushed further. Half surged right and fell in line with the 2 lieutenants, while the other half pushed left and charged into battle in my wake. Through the mass of bodies and defenders trying to stop me, I saw the wooden tower push into range and drop its bridge. Ashton was the first out of the tower with his shield raised and glowing. His whole body was surrounded in a bright golden light as he charged headlong into his own line of enemies. Anders was hot on his heels with his axe raised and ready. His first swing cut through 3 soldiers standing too close together, reminding me of my own, killing anything it hit. Hugo came barreling out last, but Shield dashed so far into the enemy lines that he cleared enough room for the next dozen that came after him. The move seemed so practiced that you would never assume he didn't normally use shields. With me on one side and Anders and Hugo on the other, we fought our way toward each other through all resistance. Swords, axes, and maces were brushed aside with ease as our foothold atop the walls grew. Meteor Strike had my hammer come screaming down, crushing the skull of the woman with her sword raised to strike. The next was a man barely into adulthood who died with his chest caved in. I hadn't even needed to use a skill. The next was sent flying off the wall into what could only be death's waiting arms. If not from the broken ribs, then the 50-foot fall. If he'd fallen feet first, maybe, but he'd fallen headfirst over the edge. The next and the next and the next. Each swing brought death, and those who evaded never did so for long. I gained ground with every step. Every swing widened the ground we had. Spells rained down on both sides as the fighting continued. The riot of clashes and screams was the same on any battlefield, and it was always chaotic. The stench, too. The blood. My next strike had to be hastily pulled back as I saw Anders' blood-covered face standing before me. I'd almost mistook him for an enemy. "I told you we'd meet in the middle, my lord." Anders smiled, blood covering his teeth and face. His axe was covered in gore similar to my weapon. I gazed around me only to see people wearing my own colors. The sounds of fighting had dulled, as my immediate area was now devoid of people to fight. Cole and Val could still be heard behind me, and Ashton was well in front of me. Down below, Elliot's own bout as well. I quickly gauged where my presence was most needed, and concluded that I was needed down below. It was where the clashes were loudest. "I'm going to help Elliot. You go help Ashton," I said, walking to the inner side of the wall, looking below. The mass of bodies fought in incomprehensible lines. Some members in blue had pushed deep while others hadn't, leaving the front wavy and hard to decipher. "The steps are over there." Anders' voice was cut off as I vaulted over the ramparts and into the city below. Mana surged into my hammer as Shattering Hammer and Meteor Strike surged, and finally Hammer Reverberation tacked on top. My hammer's inner glow caught the eye of a few hapless foes below me, but it was much too late for them. The ground shook as I landed. Snow, blood, and dust exploded out in a ring around me as dozens died in one strike. I would have swung again, but there was no one close enough to hit that was still alive. Now where is the leader? It was time to end this. Chapter 424, should have before. Max, guard captain of Smooth Rock. Point of view. Location, Smooth Rock. Death rained from the sky in the form of a giant hammer. Killed indiscriminately and utterly. Max could only watch as his men, some of whom were friends, exploded from an unseen force. Some weren't even hit by the swing, but they died all the same. It was futile. All of it was futile. What was the point of resisting if one swing ended your existence? What was the point if an errant breeze from the swing ripped you limb from limb? Frozen blood fell on the area in a mockery of what he'd once enjoyed. Every Canadian had a fondness for snow, but this was just cruel. When Max had first heard that Frostheim was coming, he hadn't thought that much of it. Will had said they would get help from the east, that Lord Claremont would send someone to take care of things before they ever reached Smoothrock's walls. That had been a lie. When the army had stationed itself outside the walls and declared that the city had been under siege, he had expected Will to surrender. Sure, Smoothrock had the numbers, but even the least informed of them knew of the Lord of Frost and what he could do. You didn't live that close to someone like that and not know about him. Will had insisted help would come. When doubts grew, Will smothered them with a heavy hand. There weren't many people who could do anything about it, with him being the strongest person within the city's walls. Then, when spring reversed to winter, and snow fell from the sky and a cold deeper than any winter day assaulted the city, Will refused to admit defeat. When stones rained down, he refused to admit it was over. When the giant jumped over the wall and dispensed death like he was the Reaper himself, Max finally thought Will would come to his senses. Their lord did not. He refused all the way up to the point a hammer fell from the sky and flattened him into the ground. He died with a dozen others who had been standing close to the impact site, and all fared the same. Even for someone as strong as Will, he ended up mangled and crushed. Seeing Will die, Max froze. He wasn't sure what to do. He had defended the city because he had been ordered to, even against his better judgment. It was his duty. He'd done it for years. Max stood against every settlement wave and even fought against a small host of demons for the city. He rode south and fought blight-infested orcs. Yet, in the face of certain death, Max froze. The Lord of Frost stepped out of the impact site none the worse for wear and wielded his hammer with an ease unfitting for something that large. Now that he was up close, Max had to look up at the towering man covered in frost. He towered over the battle in more ways than one. Max turned right to see more of his friends being cut down by a shifting suit of armor. Metal weaved into any shape necessary for the moment, bringing death to anyone who stood against it. It wasn't the overwhelming force of pure strength, but it ended in the same result. With your blood sprayed onto the ground to color the snow. Up above, guards fell from the wall with sickening thuds and cracks. The best fate was those who were already dead before they hit the ground. Max couldn't muster up the courage to raise his sword. Instead, it clattered to the ground along with his shield. He raised his hands, hoping for mercy. "I surrender!" he shouted, like they should have done from the beginning, before cowering from the stones raining down. Before suffering through the coldest week many of them had ever experienced. Before so many of his friends died. The din of battle drowned out his words, so he shouted at his men, "Stop fighting! It's over. Lay down your swords." Like they had been ready for this moment, the fighting stopped nearly instantly. Swords, axes, and shields clattered to the ground one after another, and the riotous din of battle lowered until only a few last clangs could be heard. Death bored its gaze into him with disapproval. "Where's your leader?" The voice was rough, but demanded to be answered. Max tried to control his instinctual shaking at being the direct attention of someone who could kill him with a light flick. Not trusting his voice, Max pointed to the impact site where a dozen lay dead. The Lord of Frost turned, and Max felt like a mountain had been lifted off his shoulders, only for it to return as the man's attention returned. "Who's next in line?" he asked, seeing that his query was already deceased. Dread settled in Max's gut. I am." Smooth Rock didn't have that large a political structure. Will was the pylon owner and administrator, while Max was the guard captain. The pylon wasn't high enough for much more than that. Will wasn't even a lord in the true sense. He hadn't received the Baron title yet, as he was waiting for reinforcements before initiating the upgrade. It wasn't like it used to be, where a few D-ranks were enough to face the wave. Not that he would ever get it now. "Good enough," the warrior said. "Gather the regular citizens and help calm things down. I don't want to do any more damage than I already have." Max looked around at the shattered buildings from the bombardment, the hundreds of dead, and the ruined wall that had taken them months to build and enchant. He said nothing except, "Whatever you need." Chris' point of view. Finding my next target already dead was a surprise, but not an unwelcome one. It beat chasing him around the city with the amount of collateral damage that came with it. It was a bit disappointing that the fight hadn't been worthy. I hadn't even known who the leader was, and he hadn't stood out in any way. My aura sense wasn't the best now that it was missing a pillar making it up, but it was still good enough for general power senses, and the man hadn't stood out. I had come expecting a fight like the one I'd had with Tasunka or Robert. Both of those had been challenging in a satisfying way. This one was not, but I didn't have time to dwell on that long. The battle hadn't even been long enough for the back line to enter the city yet. There were still warriors making their way through the breach. The plan had been for the mages and rangers to run up the tower and use the walls against the city. Not that it ever came to pass. Hal and Abigail were still outside, leaving me to deal with most of this mess. Thankfully, getting the fighting to stop and rein everyone in was surprisingly easy. The fight had left the defenders, and it didn't appear like it would be coming back anytime soon. While I was sure there were still some Oathbound who wanted to continue, they refrained. Smoothrock's healers got to work not long after, and our own streamed in through the gap in the walls as well. Not many on our side were injured, but it wasn't like faction affiliation mattered at this point. Healers on both sides got to work on everyone, no matter which side they were on. While they did that, I got Killian and his team to start searching the city. I doubted Ryan was here, but it didn't hurt to be thorough. When Abigail arrived, she started taking over most of the coordinating, leaving me to find the pylon. It wasn't the most time-pressing issue, but gaining control over it now was something I could do other than standing around doing nothing. I knew from experience that my presence invoked fear. I'd gotten looks and stares after Lakeshore, and sometimes being there personally made things worse rather than better. I'd have to help smooth things out later, but now wasn't exactly the best time. The pylon was in the basement of one of the nicest houses in the city. Similar to Marcus, the leader here didn't feel the need for a defensive keep or citadel, instead, preferring a nice mansion. I found it odd, but I hadn't built it. Pylon claimed, Smooth Rock has been added to your faction. The land shifted ownership to our faction, and those with the right skills could now begin their work, figuring out what we were left with. Abigail had a few that would help, along with Sophia and Grace. After claiming the pylon, there wasn't much for me to do. My job had been to take the city, and that part was done. I could hunt down the city's treasury or go searching for valuables, but those would be gathered in time. None of the Oathbound would steal, and no one from Smooth Rock would be leaving the city anytime soon. Instead, I went back to the ruins and began gathering up the dead, as had become habit after large battles like this. I hadn't had the chance after the battle with the reservation, which was just another reason to hate Ryan. Instead, Gabriel had done it in my stead. I had made it back in time for the funerals. I'd made sure of that. Most of our dead were outside the walls. The initial charge was the most dangerous part, where a lucky shot could do you in. Ballistic bolts and catapult stones weren't something most people could handle straight on. Even I had to be wary of some. A few with lucky arrows in just the right place. The body I picked up then had an arrow sticking straight out of the eye hole in his helmet. A 1 in a million shot that had brought an end to a warrior's life. Some were the result of traps going off. I silently gathered all who had fought for me and paid the ultimate price and encased them in ice, just like every other who had fallen before them. The only difference was that the icy coffin lacked the spiritual touch it usually had. As the hours stretched on, I ended up with 6 rows of 10, with an unfinished 7th row holding 4. 64 wouldn't be making the trip home, and this was only the first city in our path. Before the campaign was over, there would be more. 2.5% was a great casualty rate. A tremendous one when assaulting a city, but it still hurt to look out over the ranks. That number also didn't include those who were now out of action for the remainder of our campaign. Hundreds were missing limbs and would need to be sent back to Frostheim to be healed. There were heavily wounded who would be months before they saw battle again. That percentage was much higher than 2.5%. Just from the healers running around trying to gather up severed limbs. There were hundreds, and I knew there would be more before the day was over. I'd thought that once the healers improved and leveled up, the need to chop off arms and legs would go down. Didn't. If anything, it went up. Being able to heal back whatever was removed gave them much greater leeway with life-saving measures. Blood loss from a crushed limb that would take too much to heal? Cut it off. Leg bone shattered with fragments of bone cutting up veins and arteries? Cut it off. A chest wound that would drain the body of energy to heal, but also had wounds elsewhere? Cut it off. Removing superfluous appendages so you didn't die from more serious wounds was becoming common practice instead of being phased out as healers improved. It also helped save mana so that healers could work on more patients. The pile of limbs outside the first aid tent still uneased me, though. I wouldn't know the exact numbers until everything was settled. The lieutenants would check with those under them, the vice-captains would compile it all, and the captains would tell me. I just hoped that when Elliot, Hal, and Gabriel finally came, the number wasn't too high. We had more cities to conquer. Chapter 425, You Are Healed. Ryan Claremont Point of View. Ryan's life following what happened only processed in flashes. Brief moments of discord memory that were nearly impossible to make sense of. Delirium was his one and only friend, while his body seemed to go through a circus ride of self-defense mechanisms. He would wake in darkness, covered in sweat and feel so hot that a fire seemed chilly, and then others, he would wake in daylight to the chills so cold the frozen north seemed warm. Day and then night, hot and then cold, sweating out of every pore and then shivering with his entire body. It went on for so long that Ryan began to lose his mind. He would wake to see a black-haired woman staring down at him one time, only to see a blonde one the next. Then a man of scrawny stature, only to follow up with a man the size of a door. Ryan never remained coherent for long, and the shattered line of disconnected memories didn't make any sense. The only good thing he could remember was that the length of those memories was increasing. Every time he awoke, he stayed that way for a little longer until he started to put the pieces of what happened back together. Remembering was difficult. It was like his body didn't want to remember what happened, but his unconscious dreaming mind did not care what his conscious one thought. Nightmares of what happened plagued his dreams like an annoying gnat that wouldn't go away. Those nights were the worst. Still, Ryan dragged himself back together one piece at a time, only to wake up one final time and not know where he was. The room was unfamiliar, the furnishings were unfamiliar, and even the construction was unfamiliar. The windows were clearer and thinner than at home. The curtains were thinner, more to block out light than the cold. The dressings were made of cotton rather than wool. The flourishes were different, like even the eye for artistry leaned a different way. Most importantly, it was blisteringly hot in a way he had never experienced before. The heat hung thick in the air and clung to him in ways most unpleasurable. That fact alarmed him more than any other. Nowhere in Canada would ever be this hot, and nowhere would feel this thick. Even in summer, which was another worrying thought in it and of itself. Ryan wasn't even sure how much time had passed since the incident, and it could very well be the dog days of summer for all he knew. That would certainly explain the heat. But that would mean half a year had passed, which was a much longer time than Ryan had assumed. A much longer time indeed. He did not need the constant nightmares to remind him that he had been injured. The full body ache and soreness was more than enough for that, but it did not speak well if it had taken this long. Especially with his particular skill set. His bloodline should have made healing much easier. He wouldn't go so far as to call it trivial, but accelerated at least. His passive mana circling around his body and through his channels should have at least been enough to hasten his natural regeneration. The twin circles around his mana core should have concentrated any effects as well, as it boosted any effects of his mana, including passive ones. Even without external healing, it should not have taken this long. It doesn't. Oh, you're finally awake. And it seems like for good this time. A woman's voice broke him out of his thoughts. He startled around only to see the black-haired woman from before. How did she get in? I didn't hear anything at all. Who? How long? Where am I? All of the questions he had tried to come out at once. The woman laughed at his confusion. Laughed at him. No one had laughed at him since. Ryan couldn't remember it had been so long. Before he could insist on answers, she spoke before he could. Why don't we start with what you remember? She asked, but it felt like she was teasing him. Ryan dredged up all he could recall and began going through it once more. The fight, the injuries, trying to flee, then the contract. No, that was a dream. It had to be. Ah, the woman said lightly. I see you've gotten to the good part. As if summoning it from his memory, she pulled out the contract. The signed contract had Ryan's name at the bottom of it in red ink. He didn't have to think long or hard to wonder what it was. It's true then, he said. Defeated. She gave him a pitying smile. I'm afraid so. She put a finger to her chin and looked up. Then again, I don't really care, so I can't say I'm frightened. Her eyes fell on him. But you should be. Ryan lay there. He had hoped the contract hadn't been real and instead been a figment of his nightmare. But seeing it now, he knew it wasn't so. He had signed it. Resigned, he asked, Where am I? It's much too hot for anywhere in the north. Atlanta, she answered. Far from that wretched place. Even now, in the midst of summer, it's probably snowing somewhere. Summer, he muttered. It really was months after the fact. Why did you not take me home? To Ottawa, my seat of power. With the contract signed, it didn't much matter where they kept him. The chain wrapped around him was not contingent on being close by. The woman, Maeve, he now remembered, giggled. Her giggle turned into a true laugh the longer it went on. Like the very thought was funnier than first assumed. Your seat of power, she mocked and wiped her eye. That's a good one. Well, if we'd left you in your seat of power, you'd be facing an army at your walls right about now. An army I don't think you'd be keen on facing. An army? Ryan wanted to shoot up in alarm, but the pain stopped him. What are you talking about? Maeve looked at him with a curious face. What did you expect would happen when you poked the bear? Rather, the giant in this case. That you'd give him a poke with your fancy sword and he'd just bugger off to parts unseen without a word? That he'd go lick his wounds without retaliation. Poked the bear? The giant? He lives? Still? She laughed. No, he had quite a lot to say about it, in fact. He got every faction in the Northeast to embargo you. He had the American faction close off the coast to you, and restricted all travel and trade going in and out of New Canada. The Firelands, Imperial lands, and even the Lakes Alliance is closed to you. What about the army? Ryan asked. Hush! I'm getting to that point. She quieted him. When he was done cutting off all access, he declared war right then and there. The reason is actually pretty funny if you ask me. Do you want to know why? She teased him like she wasn't talking about the fall of his faction. Why? He played along, deeming it the quickest way to get to the point. He did it to find you. She poked him in the chest. Oh, he searched and searched for you for days, weeks even. Her smile twisted into a frown. I had to spend weeks up there just to get you away unseen. Those hounds of his were thorough, the tireless beasts. She tisked. Why is that funny? Her smile returned. Because you're not even there. She laughed. After gathering his army, Fort Hope fell without a blade being drawn, its lord surrendering the city and joining his side. Smooth Rock fell within a week. St. Marie even faster at only a few days, and Shield Reach fell within a day. Its lord thought besting him in single combat would work. Spoiler alert. She leaned in and whispered, it didn't. For cities? All fallen? His faction was not so large that such a loss wouldn't be felt. New Canada wasn't as large as the American faction, and 4 cities, even smaller ones, would hurt to lose. Sadly, your woes don't end there. While Christopher was conquering your western reaches, your east coast has proclaimed itself independent. Leon, Ryan spat angrily. That fucker. I knew I should have killed that Newfie bastard when I had the chance. Yes, Leon. Maeve tittered at his bitterness. He's taken over the island and even some of the coastal cities as well. Even rose to Viscount last I heard. A feat even you didn't accomplish. The contracts, Ryan remembered. He shouldn't have been able to. It's rare to see one broken. Maeve cut him off. And it takes a great deal to do so, but not unheard of. Considering the creatures the pact is founded on, it's not that unimaginable. A race so crafty, cunning, and full of guile isn't one to be bound by their pacts for eternity. If you wanted that, you should have gone to the Fae. If that's the case, I can... But don't worry, she patted him on his aching shoulder. We've taken precautions with yours so that won't happen. By the look on her face, she purposely didn't explain anything more. Leon, free of his contract and with attention drawn to the west, carved out a nice little piece of coastland for himself. Seeing how Frosthaim's advance has yet to be halted, I imagine he faced little reprisal in his actions. By her smile, she was taking delight in regaling him with the downfall of his faction, of the kingdom he'd built. Maeve stood from the chair beside his bed and bounded lightly toward the open window. Now, the Frost Lord stands outside your seat of power, sieging down your walls as we speak. Admittedly, your capital is lasting longer than the 4 previously, but I doubt it'll be long before it falls, too. I'm surprised it's taken longer than a month already. Ryan regained some hope at hearing Ottawa still stood. Leon was his own problem, but if his capital was holding out, I rebuilt that city from the ground up. I poured everything into its walls and construction. He won't be able to tear it down so easily, he said with pride. She turned back at him with that pitying look again. Easily? No. But will it be done? Most assuredly. I told you already, you poked the bear you should have left alone. Now, your faction crumbles while you sit here crippled and delirious. Ryan's anger was stoked at her dismissal of all he had built. Assuredly? If you're so certain we will fail, why did you even aid me? If what you say is true, I will be the leader of ashes and rubble soon. What use do you have for the Lord of Ruins? Me? She pointed at herself. Nothing. I'd see you killed and be done with it, but as I mentioned earlier, it's not me you should be worried about. Your usefulness is up to the big man, even if you are the Lord of nothing and no one. Ryan didn't even ask who the big man was, doubtful he'd get a straight answer or one even remotely useful. Instead, he asked, why am I not healed? Even if he wasn't a lord, to be useful, he first needed to be healthy. He didn't imagine he'd be of much use in the state he was in. Maeve finally showed an emotion bordering on serious as she looked at him pensively. "You are. What are you talking about?" Ryan demanded. He raised his left arm expecting to throw the blanket off him, but nothing happened. He looked down to see it just as he had last, with nothing below the shoulder. "I still have no arm." "Yes," she said. "But can you not feel the leg we've regrown? And the other injuries we've mended?" Ryan twitched both legs and confirmed that both were there, and the rest of his body did feel mended. There were aches but no sharp pains like there had been. But he still had no arm. "You call this healed?" He tried to wave what was left of his arm, but it did nothing but twitch. "You are as healed as we can make you." Her words felt particularly chosen. "We'll see about that." His mana churned, and his skin began to glow. Regenerate, heal, and greater mend activated at once. The skills weren't directly suited for limb regrowth, but they worked with the aid of overpowering mana. When nothing happened except becoming luminous, Ryan called on his bloodline to amplify his powers. He felt the change occur and the power flowing through him, but his eyes failed to see any change in what they were looking at. His arm remained, dreadfully, unaffected. Even cycling through his other skills and spells did nothing. "I told you." Maeve watched him spend mana like it was limitless and radiate a massively displeasing glow. "You are healed, but my arm is still gone." Chapter 426. Ever Forward. Chris' point of view. Location, Ottawa. I sat upon a ledge of ice and watched the snow fall from the summer sky. Months now we had been at this. Months this war had lasted, and I had long grown weary of the weight that had to be bared. Still, there were times, moments that helped ease that weight, and now was one of those. My spirit, over the days and weeks, had slowly begun to knit itself back together. The tear that had nearly sheared it nearly in two had begun to slowly close. I had known the injury wasn't permanent, but I also hadn't expected it to last this long either. Half a year, and my spirit was just beginning to pull itself back together. It was an injury like no other, and I was only just now realizing how long it would be until the wound was healed. Torn as it was, it did not leave me ignorant of the changes I was feeling. The hum that sometimes rippled through it. Those vibrations had once been accompanied by pain when the wound was still fresh, but now they were rather soothing. Something about watching the snow accumulate over the city, especially now, in the midst of summer, caused that hum to stir inside me. I knew where the path ended, but it was the journey to get there that remained elusive. Authorities were different than other powers. There were none other like it. Skills, spells, laws, runes, and bloodlines came close, but there was a fundamental difference between those and an authority. Those followed guidelines, rules, structure which authorities stood without. Skills and spells were expressions of mana or stamina fueled with intent and will, but they were not formless. There was a structure backing them, a matrix that held them up so that they may exert their will on the world. Bloodlines were derived from essence and formed around that energy to facilitate its power. Laws were expressed through our own will, but they were not ours. Like runes, they were foundations for meaning that we tapped into, not created. Authorities, though, were the first time that the will of the person asserted itself on the will of the world in a way that required nothing other than spirit and the willpower to use it. There were no crutches holding it up, no form that it leaned upon. It was a power derived only from the spirit, and in doing so, required no outside source or external help. It was what could make them one of the most powerful sources of strength, but it was also what could make them the weakest. When power was derived from only one source, it could be influenced in no other way if that source was lacking. A weak spirit led to a weak authority, and there was no amount of stats, mana, or levels that would change that. To make things even more tenuous, it wasn't guaranteed that a strong spirit led to a strong authority. Like anchors, they had to be formed, realized. In that process, even with a strong spirit, they could be formed short of their best. Just as how anchors before them could be forced from images or ideas not entirely perfect to explain who you were. My first authority still remained out of grasp, but I felt myself getting closer. Inching toward the finish line, even if it was only one small step at a time. Taking that next step was different than the first one. Harder. Like anchors, authorities were entirely introspective, but unlike anchors, they did not come with a question you had to ask yourself. There wasn't a guiding thought you could work towards. For anchors, you delved into who you were, examined the core of what made you you. They were the foundation that you built off of, but also kept your spirit from crumbling under the weight of future power. An authority without an anchor would rip the spirit apart. It was well documented and written about and always ended the same way, with the person's spirit extinguished. Authorities were formed at their core by what they were. As their name suggested, they were the power to enforce. Enforce what, you may ask? Anything. They could enforce anything you wanted them to. They expressed your will and enforced it upon the world. Whatever authority was formed, your spirit would enforce it on the world around you. Some called them domains, but they weren't, truly. Those came later after forming more than one authority. They could cause light to dim and cause night to fall in the middle of the day. They could do the opposite and enforce the sun to rise at night. They could turn winter into summer and summer into winter. They could affect more than just the environment, too. They could enforce healing on those who need it. Enforce gravity on those near you. Enforce emotions like courage, bravery, and valor. Negative ones, too, like fear, despair, and cowardice. Even lust, in the case of some more promiscuous races. They could be turned inward, too. Enforce strength beyond your body's ability. Enforce mana beyond your normal control. Enforce endurance beyond your limits. Fortitude beyond your means. With such a wide range of what authorities could be, and with no guiding question to seek the answer for, it made them the hardest to form. It was what made the path of the spirit so much harder than the body or the mind. So I sat on my ledge of ice and listened to the dull hum inside me, hoping to grasp anything that would lead me further towards the right answer, to see the path forward. My inward gaze saw nothing. It only felt the faint resonance and nothing beyond that. "Chris?" A voice turned my attention outward to see Hal standing behind me, bow in hand. "It's time." Old, partially healed cuts and new scars drew my eye. They were proof of the toll this war had caused. Everyone had a new scar that they didn't have before I had called them to war. Some had missing limbs instead of just scars. And some had paid more than others. Now it was time to do it again. We had been outside Ottawa for over a month now, and it was time to see how high a toll the city would extract from me. How many coffins I would be forming after this was all over. 3 times I had brought death upon a city, and this would be my 4th. "Chris," Hal repeated when I didn't respond. "I understand," I said quietly. Hal lingered, as if to say something more, but walked away after deciding not to. I sighed, rising from my chair of snow and turning away from the city's walls. Walls we had been shelling for weeks now to no avail. Walls that were currently being showered in magic, as mages cast spell after spell in an attempt to soften them up. A failed attempt. They were tall and strong, stronger than the 3 before them. Like Frostbound, great effort and resources had been poured into their construction to stand between the city and those who would harm it. We would have to do this the hard way. There was no section of wall we managed to bring down. The wall was too tall to create a ramp as I had in Smooth Rock. The formation etched into the stone wasn't of the same caliber either. Ottawa was a true representative of what a capital of a faction should look like. And we were about to storm the walls anyway. I stepped wordlessly into my tent and gazed upon my armor. Worn, but still strong. Scratched, but still sound. The metal still thick, and runes still filled with power. I put it on silently and only paused to check it once. My hammer came last, and I paused before the weapon planted in the corner of my tent. The red tint had been cleared from the ice, but I could still picture what it had looked like covered in blood. What it would look like in mere hours. Give me strength to do what needs to be done. Give those sworn to me good fortune in the battle to come. And if it should come to it, give them the death of a warrior so that they might live on somewhere beyond here. My hands found their familiar place, and the frosty wood settled into my hand naturally as I pulled it from the ground. It had been years since I thought of what happened after death, but with as much as I'd seen the past few months, It was a topic I revisited more and more. I remembered watching my father pass, and the hope inside me that the halls of Valhalla were real, that dying a warrior's death meant it would not be the last time I saw him. I now had that same hope for those who died fighting for me. Selfish, maybe, so that my guilt was eased, but I hoped all the same. It wasn't only for those who fought and died for me either. It was for those I felled as well. A number that only seemed to grow. Some deserved what my hammer brought them, but not all. Some only had the misfortune of standing against me on the field of battle and having a fate that put them in the path of my search for Ryan. It was for those that I hoped there was something more. Hammer in hand, I walked over to Cole's section of camp to begin. I could feel the use of taunting skills even from where I stood, and it didn't take me long to reach the area. Beasts from the nearby forest or monsters from a nearby dungeon break were throwing themselves at men and women wielding shields and thick armor. The beasts ignored anything around them and continued their single-minded pursuit of the person in front of them. Every so often, a wave emanated from the warrior, keeping the beasts taunted, forcing the monster's attention to remain on them. Without a word, I walked up to the closest beast, a mangy and feral thing, a dungeon break from somewhere, and brought my hammer down. The beast never saw its end coming. Weight of the Arctic began to build. A few minutes later, I did it again, and again, and again. For 3 hours the weight built and I felt my body grow in power. I felt the Arctic building, swirling inside me, like I had repositioned the North Pole to be my core, and all of its power was contained within my flesh. Since upgrading my body to copper, the usual strain and feeling of tearing myself apart were absent. My flesh and bones were stronger now than they were then, and the sizable weight of the Arctic, placed upon my shoulders, was contained, albeit carefully. With the weight of the Arctic at its peak, I placed my bloody hammer upon my back and looked the circle of Oathbound around me. The crowd had grown as the time wore on, as everyone knew what would happen when my peak was reached. Every person was adorned in armor. Every person had their weapon at the ready. Every person was prepared without a word being needed from me. I spoke for just the second time that day. It's time. Assume your positions. The crowd broke off into sections, which then broke off further. Wooden towers were climbed, and mages settled into their protected room. Those who would push stood behind the wooden behemoths with grim faces, those on the outside more than the others. Elliot took up the right side of one tower with Hugo taking up the left, a dozen others filling in between the two. Ashton and Valerie, another. Cole and Avery, a third. Wherever they could, the lieutenants and order leadership took the hardest roles, just as I had always done. But there were more towers than lieutenants. People stepped up when needed, even though they knew what it would mean. A man stood on the outside right side of a tower with his hands shaking and his face pale, but he stood there all the same. The woman on the left looked much the same, but I knew when the horn sounded, she would push. Anders looked at me from the left side of the tower front and center. His axe strapped to his back. His hands rested on the left post of the tower that would see the most fire out of all of them. It would be the first and the center of our attack. Filled with power and brimming with strength, I walked up to the right side and grasped hold of the wood. My fingers dug into the wood, but it held. I looked back upon the dozen towers being pushed by hundreds of warriors. This would be the last time I would see some of them alive. Even so, I pulled the horn from my belt and blew. Wood creaked and snow crunched. Men and women heaved against the weight of the towers, but the wheels began to turn. Some faster than others. None faster than mine. Magic exploded as our mages opened fire to cover our advance, but my attention was held solely by the ground in front of me. I smoothed the snow and filled in any dips I could find. The wheels found no holes to fall in or obstacles to bar them. I pushed, and my tower lurched forward. Ever forward. Chapter 427, First to Bleed. Anders' point of view. Location, Ottawa. Anders strained in an effort to give his all in pushing the tower forward. Being opposite his lord, the tower threatened to veer to the left under his vastly greater strength. Anders couldn't have countered on his own, but the work of dozens of people barely kept their path straight. They could have asked Chris to slow down, to tone down how hard he was pushing, but none of them were willing to do so. They knew how he was, and he wouldn't for a second consider not being first into the breach. That just wasn't how the man was built. Instead, Anders felt the familiar power of northern rage coursing through him, making him that much better at keeping up. The others to his right were doing the same, with some even going so far as to call on their bloodline for strength. And furthest to his right, Lord Christopher stood at his normal stature and pushed with the force of over a dozen men, while also controlling the ice in front of them to make their path smooth. Anders could feel his deft hand manipulating the ice. Ice was his own affinity, and he was proud of his ability with it, but people like Christopher accomplished such feats effortlessly, as if they had been born with such power. The ice arranged itself at his call like every crystal was sworn to him, leaping to do his bidding like every oath-bound would, like Anders himself would. Under the intoxicating feeling of northern rage and other boosting skills from the mages, he felt the underlying power of Frost. The power he'd gotten ever since his lord picked the skill. It had been a shock at first. A boost was applied when he had done nothing to activate it, like a lesser version of rage, applied to him by outside forces. It gave him strength, it gave him speed, it gave him toughness, and, most importantly of all, it gave him courage. Not physically, that wasn't how the skill worked, but the knowledge and the feeling inside him, knowing his lord was there. It gave him courage to look at the approaching spells and arrows, boulders and ballistae, and remain unflinching. Even when his skin tore and spells exploded at his feet, he pushed onward. His steps never faltered, nor did anyone else's. Closer and closer they marched, their tower rumbling forward. Screams came from the unlucky behind him, but no one turned back. Spells ravaged the area around them. Arrows charged with mana exploded on impact. Thousands stood upon the walls, aiming to stop them. Anders looked over at Christopher and saw a man resolute. No hesitation, no fear, unflinching. His armor of ice shed attacks as fast as they came in. What his ice didn't stop, his skin did. Full-powered arrows that cut into Anders and drew blood bounced off him like they were toothpicks. Awe swelled within him, awe and pride. It helped him push through the pain. When an arrow embedded itself in his arm, he pushed on, just as his lord would have done. As Anders had seen him do, when a fireball impacted his back, burning his skin and hair, he pushed on. The wooden tower creaked under the assault, but the mages inside did their job. Mana shields sprang up to block the worst of the assault, and the towers themselves weren't so fragile. Spells of fire and stone hit shields of mana. Lightning splashed against those same shields, and so did every other element. Arrows thudded into wood, coating the front armor of the tower like a pincushion. He lowered his head and pushed. What happened around him was of no consequence. His job, his duty, was to get the tower in place, and that is what he would do. It came as a surprise when the tower lurched to an abrupt halt. The sudden and unexpected stop of running into the wall sent a jarring force through his body, but he didn't have time to recover. Anders knew he wouldn't be the first up the stairs, but he was certainly going to be the second. Already, he saw Christopher taking the steps 2, 3 at a time. Anders ripped the axe from his back and ran up after him. As he did, the man's back only seemed to grow. His 6-foot stature expanded to 7, then 8, then finally settled at over 9. The wood groaned under his additional weight, and the whole tower started to sway as the steps bore his weight. Anders called on his own humble bloodline. It wasn't the frost giant lineage of his lord, or the lineage of great dragons. It was a simpler animal but matched his nature perfectly, and that sometimes made up all the difference. Ever since he'd first seen them roaming the far north, Anders knew the bloodline was right for him. Thick hair began to cover his arms and legs, not unsimilar to those with Ursine bloodlines. But where they differed was the thundering steps and increasing charge speed he ran with. An ethereal horn overlaid upon the blade of his axe, and he held it in front of him to lead his charge. Holy rhinos weren't the flashiest, but they fit his nature. To charge headlong and through, unrelenting. The top of the tower came fast with the power coursing through him. The external boosting skills, Frostguard Oathbound, Northern Rage, and his bloodline kept him only a few steps behind Christopher, which was a feat in and of itself. What happened next would be something Anders would always admire. The front wall of the tower was still raised and was the only thing keeping them sheltered from attack. To reach the wall, it needed to be pushed down and turned into a bridge. Christopher never hesitated. He knew what awaited him, being the first out of the tower. He knew what stood on the other side, the primed and ready attacks that would assail him. His steps never once faltered. To be first, the vanguard, the most dangerous and the first to bleed. It was why Christopher would always have his respect and his loyalty. He slammed into the wood, and it flew down, biting into the wall in front. Magic exploded, and Anders couldn't see anything besides the flash of spell fire and the silhouette of Chris standing in front of him. Taking it all so those sworn to him didn't have to. It sparked something in him. The image, the idea, the belief resonated with something deep inside him. Like an idea was just starting to solidify and form. Anders knew what it was, but didn't have the time to focus on it. Chris had already pushed out onto the wall, and Anders needed to be behind him. His charge took him one step behind Chris and out onto the wooden bridge connecting the tower and the wall. Anders finally got a clear view of what awaited them without the large Chris-shaped wall blocking most of his vision. The walls were a dozen feet thick, and on them in both directions stood line after line of defenders. Line after line of shields set and linked to receive their charge. Behind them and in raised towers, bows and mage staves aimed down, drawn and ready to blow them away. Large ballistae swiveled away from the charging mass behind them and focused their aim at where Anders and Christopher stood now. Fear gripped him and Anders smiled. He grinned large and wide, ready to face what may. Fear was good. Fear meant he was still alive and he aimed to keep it that way. Chris stepped forward into the line of shields and swung his hammer in a devastating arc mana radiated from the weapon in such quantities that it prickled his skin, even underneath his armor. The hammer was alight with dancing lights of violet and green in a way Anders knew what followed. His expectations, if anything, didn't do the results justice. The line of shields didn't just falter, but crumple completely. The man on the receiving end of the swing ceased to exist, and his life was reduced to coloring the men and women around him, along with the stone he once stood upon. That's what nearly 7,000 points of strength does. The wave of force that followed killed or heavily maimed the rest of those who were first or second in line. The third line fared better, but even they had gaps from those who were hit worse or couldn't withstand the mountain of force slammed atop them. With the line broken, Anders grasped his axe and used relentless charge. His bloodline sang inside him. It saw the softened enemies and rejoiced in the perfect target. One step, two, and he was upon them. His axe reached back and came swinging around in a cruel arc, leaving motes of frost in its wake. Cleave layered atop, sever layered atop, penetrating slash, layered atop, unyielding swing. The practice of layering skills that had come from Austin, rather than his lord, but he needed everything at his disposal to keep up. With relentless charge, northern rage, and ice armor already active, it was the most he could do at once. 7 active skills were his limit. His axe met raised shields and cleaved through them with little resistance. The blade bit into metal for only a second before the skills powering it forced it through and into flesh, before parting that as well. His charge took him forward and into his next enemy before his swing could, and the same fate befell them as did the next. Fire! Anders heard, but couldn't do anything about it. He wielded no shield, and his axe was in motion. He could only brace for the pain, and pain it was. Spells burned through ice armor, like it wasn't even there. His law doing little against the laws of so many others. His armor held out better, made by Christopher himself, but even that wasn't perfect against facing so many attacks. His skin broke and tore, burned and shocked. Arrows embedded, painfully, into him and spells tried to rip him asunder. The same happened to Chris beside him, only with his size and increased threat level drawing more of the fire. Anders turned to see a 6-foot ballistae bolt sticking out of his shoulder, and blood running dripping to the stone. Other arrows stuck out of him at odd angles, mainly from his arms, which he'd managed to raise. Spells had a harder time chewing through his layer of ice, but managed it they did. Without his spirit, it wasn't as strong. His skin fared better than Anders, much better, but even it flagged under such concentrated fire. A roar came from behind them, as the rest of the warriors thundered up and out of the tower. The small foothold Christopher and he had managed to create wasn't large enough for those coming behind them, and they both knew it. Standing open on the wooden bridge was a death sentence, open to fire in wide angles up and down the wall. They needed more space, and they needed it now. Nothing Anders could do would accomplish it, so he turned to Chris, but he was already in motion once more. His hammer drew back, and mana filled the weapon once more, but the skills were different this time. It didn't have the same light as before, and Anders grew curious about what he was doing. Chris drew the hammer back, stepped forward, and threw. The hammer came swinging around horizontally, but instead of continuing on a normal arc, it shot off parallel to the wall they stood upon. It shot off like a cannon fired point blank, mowing down every shield, person, or spell attempting to halt it. End over end it spun, taking out a wide swath and leaving those in its wake scrambling to get out of the way. In one throw, dozens of enemies were either thrown off the wall or killed outright, leaving a 7-foot line completely empty leading off into the left. Oh! And they had just the men and women to fill it. Chapter 428, Taking the Walls. Abigail point of view. Location, Ottawa. She watched Chris disappear behind the ramparts, tightening her jaw in worry. This battle wasn't like the others. Smooth Rock, St. Marie, and Shield Reach were all smaller, localized. The fighting was brutal, yes, but quick and over relatively quickly. From what Abigail could see of the fighting going on atop the wall, this wasn't going to be anything like that. This was going to be a slog. A long, hard-fought battle where Frosthaim's forces would have to push through the wall, down the stairs into the city, and as far as they had to until a surrender or retreat was called for. From what scrying they could do, there were hundreds of troops amassed in the streets ready to meet their forces as soon as the wall was overrun. A second tower slammed into the wall and disgorged the men and women in blue to join the fight. A third followed not long after, but the wooden bridge was ripped off before anyone could cross it. Nature Mage at 3 o'clock. A spotter yelled after watching the tower fail to do its job. Abigail readied a spell, but hell beat her to it. An arrow swirling with wind mana drilled through the air quicker than any spell she could cast, piercing the chest of a staff-wielding mage with so little resistance it appeared as if he missed. That was until the man's chest exploded out behind him. Even though the mage had fallen, the tower was still without its bridge. Abigail wondered what Cole and Avery were going to do with their path blocked. They could run to the nearby tower, but that would cost them time and leave them open to getting shot at. They could also... Oh, they're leaping the distance. How could I have thought any different? The distance between the tower and the wall wasn't large, but it was still enough to be troublesome. There was a height difference that helped them, but that only worked one way. There would be no retreating, but the fools leapt without a second thought. To give them as much help as she could, she cast an overcharged torrent to the left of where they landed. Her spell shattered the hastily conjured shields to block it and swept over the wall furiously. Water crushed through and hurled the defenders every which way, with most going over the back of the wall and out of sight. From the essence coming her way, many died from the fall, if not from the spell itself. A complicated spell circled flared in front of Gabriel as he cast a spell moments after her own. The icy blue mana flew on the same path as her water did, and she felt her control over it begin to slip. Instead of fighting it, she relinquished it and watched as her water froze quickly. It started where the spell landed, but the layer of ice spread quickly. Anything wet started to frost over the wall, the ramparts, and the soldiers themselves. Some screamed as the water on their skin froze in seconds and began to burn. They didn't scream for long before they fell silent eternally. The weather helped her brother's spell spread further than it would normally allow, and an Arctic scenery was all that was left in its wake. Avery and Cole leapt from the tower to find enemies on one side frozen solid and charged to meet who was left in a savage melee. The warriors behind them followed their lead without hesitation and leapt one after another from the tower. Elliot came roaring out next in a swirl of red metal and steel. His sword and shield shifted in size and length from one step to the next as he carved out his own little foothold. With every tower that landed and people rushed out of, a new front was opened for the defenders atop the wall. Each tower was a new foothold for Frosthaim's troops to wage war. With the Order leadership to lead the charge, the troops never stood a chance. Whether it was Christopher's hammer, Anders' axe, Elliot's sword, or the 100 others rushing and charging forth, they fell quickly. Spells and arrows helped clear the way, and the essence gain made Abigail feel sick. The occasional chimes informing her of each level gain caused bile to rise in her throat. Each level was a person seen dead. Every energizing rush of essence was a life snuffed out. How does he do this? She thought. Abigail even had the advantage of casting spells from afar and not having to look her victims in the eye, and she still struggled to contain the overwhelming distaste rising in her. The urge to lean into her bloodline's heightened feelings was there, but she couldn't allow herself to block this out. Every spell, every cast, every death needed to be felt. Even if it was painful, repressing it would only make it worse. Abigail! A harsh shake drew her back to the present. She turned to see Gabriel shaking her with a concerned look on his face, but she shook it away. What? She yelled over the sound of thrumming bows and soaring magic. The last warrior is climbing now. It's our turn to charge. Gabriel yelled back. That's right. She had been caught up in her casting and errant thoughts. She forgot that it was now their turn to climb the walls. You take the center, I'll take the rightmost, and Hal can take the leftmost, her brother said loudly in her ear. He was coming into his leadership well. Abigail nodded. There was no fanfare when they charged. They weren't the screaming warriors sheltering behind shields and hoping a stray arrow or spell was going to take them out. No, their rush toward the walls was more organized and structured. They had to keep up their attacks, but they also weren't facing the same resistance. The defenders were too worried with the people already in their midst, not those rushing toward them now. Still, siege weapons weren't able to be aimed at the warriors, so their only target was the approaching backline, and they opened fire once more. Speed was of the essence but not entirely vital, so they had the added advantage of getting to defend themselves in more than just a sheet of metal and prayers. Abigail raised her staff and cast Water Whip. A large tendril of freezing cold water drew tight before snapping up and splitting the stone into pieces, before doing it again and again. What was once a major threat turned into nothing but annoying pebbles. A second and third water whip covered a large portion of their charging line, while other mages reached out and did the same to the boulders outside her range. Hal blew them out of the air with powerful arrows while Gabriel diverted them with sheets of ice. The muddy slush seeped into her boots and drenched her socks as she ran through the ruined field. The layer of snow had been trampled, melted, refrozen, and melted in such a short time that she wasn't sure what to call it anymore. Her boots were covered in muck, and it was hard to run in a straight line without slipping and falling. As bad as it sounded, walking on the bodies was easier than the slush. She passed a few as she made toward the tower. Warriors face down in the muck, unmoving. Others lay face up with dead eyes. Once again, she asked herself how Christopher did this. Stumbling her way forward, and with the occasional spell being cast, she made it to the muddy and damaged tower. She climbed the stairs much the same way the ones before her did. The sounds of battle could be heard above, and the clanging of swords and grinding of plate grew louder with every step. As she crested the top of the rickety stairwell, she saw bodies strewn about upon the stone. Both sides had dead lying on the ground, and both sides fought over them, stepping and crushing them further. An arrow screamed at her, and her mana barely completed the circle for mana shield in time to block it. Her blue mana sparked as the arrow ricocheted off. Instantly, she began casting 3 spells at once, and the trio of spell circles glowed in front of her before completing in a flash. Her burning bloodline helped with speed, and 3 water jets tore through the backline defenders. The melee was too hectic to aim spells without hitting any of the Oathbound, so she focused on the rangers and mages in the back. Water scythes, water blades, water jets, water whips, all of her spells cycled through use when needed. Scythes cut through 3 or 4 men before the mana holding it together faltered, but it could only be used when a straight line of fire was available. Jets were the same, but were smaller in diameter and had more precision rather than power. It was cut through armor under sustained casting, where scythes would not. Blades were the weakest, but the fastest and easiest to cast. They were good for providing cover fire and forcing the enemy to dodge or block. Water whips were her main assault. With water manipulation and hydrokinesis, her ability to manipulate and shape her whips was second to none. They reached around shield-bearing Oathbound and through the chaotic scrum. They wrapped around enemies and threw them up and out of the way. Where she couldn't get a good grip, she just pummeled her enemies with the weight and force of water. Others, where she couldn't crack it down on them, she tripped or pulled off balance. The water soon coated the ground and made her job even easier. She grabbed feet, shoved legs, pulled two defenders together, forcing them to hit each other rather than the Oathbound. Through it all, the essence rushed in. Every kill, every assist, every death. It wasn't long before there were no more defenders to hit. The Oathbound had pushed left and right, connecting with the tower on either side, who did the same with those further out. The pockets of resistance were crushed. What was once many fronts soon became only three. The far left side of the wall, the far right, and the stairs leading down into the city. Based on the resounding crashes and the shaking beneath her feet, she had a suspicion to where Christopher and his hammer fought. He most likely led the charge down the steps and would soon step into the streets to fight there. Abigail gazed over the inside of the wall and saw what the scryers had. A force of hundreds arrayed right where the door from the wall exited. The guard tower exited right into the waiting shields of hundreds. With the area around her cleared, her mana churned into something larger. The spell circled bloomed slower than her previous casts, but those weren't the high-grade spell this was. Blue mana extended and swirled as the circle grew, and the mana inside her core rushed out of her in one giant torrent. Not unlike what the spell of the same name did earlier. Her bloodline aided her and amplified her workings while her law did the same. She pushed more mana into the spell than it normally held, and as the circle flashed complete, a deluge of water came gushing forth. Thousands of gallons poured from the spell as her core depleted bit by bit. With two circles around it, her reserves were large, but creating that much water so quickly wasn't easy. Tsunami shaped that water into a wall of force that dropped from the sky on the defenders below, and they never stood a chance. Mana shields tried to stop it, but they shattered with just the leading edge of water falling down. Shields of oak and steel fared little better. Rank after rank fell under the wall of water, and it just kept coming. The wave crashed into the ground with such force that those directly under it died outright. The rest were forcefully pushed away, and Abigail doubted they were in much better shape. Just as the defenders got a handle on her spell and began mitigating the sheer amount of water, Chris stepped out from the door, covered in blood with frost billowing off him in waves. Multiple arrows stuck out of him at odd angles, and one was so large it had to be from a ballista. From his thundering steps and powerful swings, the injuries weren't enough to hinder his advance. Abigail wondered how much of the blood covering him was his. The water in the area flash froze in his presence, and the wave the defenders had tried to halt froze still in moments. And then it exploded in deadly shards of ice, killing everyone around it in a blink. His hammer reached out and felled more in the same breath. A skill she knew was hammer reverberation, carried his swing further than it had any right to, and every man or woman in a 15-foot radius popped like an overfilled balloon. The sheer gore of it all nearly caused her to vomit. She had been worried about stepping on dead bodies and pushing people off the wall to fall into the unknown, while he was outright bursting them into clouds of viscera. The street was filled with defenders, and even the 36 already dead by Chris was only a small dent in the total number. A new wave of defenders rushed in to stop him, but another swing sentenced them to a death the same as the last. Abigail's mana sense flared in warning, but from the Arctic touch gathering, she knew it was of no threat to her. She saw his hammer glow with so much mana that it stung her mana sense to feel. His bloodline and law concentrated it all into the icy head before he swung it down and into the ground. In one long line the entire width of the street, spears of ice tore from the ground and skewered men through. Over 30 feet of jagged icy spears killed more in one swing than she did with one tsunami. The ice gave off a haunting cold that Abigail felt from the top of the wall, and she knew it could only come from one place. Elliot and Anders stepped out of the doorway next and followed after the charging form of her brother deeper into the city. She cast spell after spell to aid them, but with those three clearing the way, it wasn't long before they were out of her range completely. Even if she ran after them, Abigail doubted she would catch up in time to do anything meaningful. With Chris at his augmented height and running at full tilt, she wouldn't be able to keep up even if she wanted to. Instead, she watched the path of destruction from the wall with the occasional building collapse or body sent screaming into the sky. Chapter 429. Death was still death. Chris' point of view. God, look at it all. The fighting had been fierce, fiercer than any other battle so far, and more importantly, bloody. Bloody and destructive. There just wasn't any quit in the defenders. Even in the face of my hammer, scores threw themselves in my wake either to die crushed or frozen. Neither end was good, and neither end was painless. At least the hammer was quick. But by God was it bloody and messy. Pulling out all of the arrows and ballistic bolts wasn't the end of the pain, either, as I always had more work to do. At least this time, I selfishly got seen to buy a healer first rather than waiting. Apparently, my blood loss was concerning, even if it wasn't even the worst I'd felt. There was none of the usual dizziness or lightheadedness that usually came with severe blood loss, but pointing that out only got me a scowl. I didn't monopolize Ashley's time, but just enough to see me to rights and close my wounds some. The real healing could be done after or with my vitality. Like many battles, there were the level gains to accompany. 2 specifically. Well, more if you counted my profession too. Runesmith had seen steady gains over the course of the campaign, but not enough to reach any significant threshold. It was still a distance away from getting my second skill. Class: D. Warden of the North, Legendary. Level 130 Profession: D. Adept Runesmith, Epic. Level 113. Looking at them both, the usual feeling of dread and regret was absent. Maybe not absent, but muted. Worn down by the repetition of feeling it again and again. It was so very hard to muster up anything other than apathy. I just couldn't keep caring. Not in the sight of such devastation and blood. Devastation in the name of someone else's schemes and follies. Oh, I saw my own hand in what happened, but what else was I supposed to do? Leave Earth to be dictated upon by men like Ryan? People willing to sacrifice anything for power? The contracts were bad enough, but to be so two-faced about it was appalling. Send out formations against demons while paying for the summoning thereof. No, I'd do the same if I went back. I'd do the same if it happened again. I'd do the same when it happened again, which made the sight of the ruined city all the more morose. Even that was dulled. Montreal was next. Quebec after that. Then whatever was left of the Far East. I'd been hearing odd rumors of what had been happening over there, and I wasn't sure how to deal with those problems yet. It also wasn't something I wanted to think about right now. Even the potential fight against this Sea Lord, as he called himself, didn't sound appealing. His swift rise to Viscount was interesting, but nothing more than that. He must have been capable of it before, but held back by Ryan. Once again, I had to refrain from the initial pacifying and reestablishing of order. People were just too frightened of me, and rightfully so. Gods, the men dead by my hand. Christopher, Anders, ever the helpful vice-captain, walked over to my seat upon the rubble. He limped and was bloodied, but was still standing strong. Stronger even from what I'd felt. The man now blazed with spirit in a way only a couple in Frostheim did. 2, to be precise. I'd felt his anchor solidify during the battle, and his fighting took on a new fervor after it did. It made me curious about what it was. I see congratulations are in order. I tried. Oh, I really tried. But I couldn't get my words to sound any more happy. Not with what lay in my sight. Anders shook his head at the ground. I couldn't have done it without you. I snorted. I doubt that. Even without me, you would have been a fine warrior anywhere. Agree to disagree, my lord, he said with his face set. He truly believed it. couldn't help but ask. I was too curious to let it go. I knew John's anchor, and I wanted to know what a man like Anders would define himself as. What was it, if you care to share? I felt you form it during the battle, I asked. Anders straightened with pride. Stand first, stand fast. The words rang with that touch of spirituality that others lacked, with a heaviness and weight to them. As good as any, I nodded firmly. It suits you well, my friend. Thank you, Christopher, Anders said. One of the rare times he called me by name. I let the moment hang for a while, but I had to forge on into less pleasant matters. By now, all of the dead had been tallied, and the wounded mostly stabilized. The number I feared the most. Not to overshadow your achievement, but I need to know. How many, Anders? I said solemnly. 346, he answered. Most from the bear, as we expected. Gods, anyone. The words died on my lips. Anyone I would know sounded so very bad. Anders took it in stride without flinching or missing a beat. Cole died securing his foothold. Hugo is missing a leg and a hand and has yet to wake up. Valerie had to have both legs amputated. Her wounds were so severe. And Avery? I asked, the last of Elliot's lieutenants besides Zion. But he wasn't here. Lost an eye, and his armor's torn to shreds, but well enough. Healers say he'll recover within the fortnight, the others months. Valerie is the worst, he answered. Foolish woman. I shook my head. Val was as ready to rush into battle as any man. Her sword was meant for swinging, as she'd say. I'd seen her launch herself into a dozen soldiers once Hugo fell. They were close, and the fury she fought with was unmatched. Her claymore reaped many lives. That leaves Elliot, you, and Ashton as our only leaders left in fighting shape, I said. Elliot used his mettle well, coming out of the battle relatively unscathed. I'd seen to him earlier, along with the rest of the Order Masters. Ashton as well, but he was fretting over the people he'd brought with him. Abigail says establishing order will take longer than she thought. Months, maybe longer. The token force you plan to leave here will need to be expanded. Ashton said he can call up his forces in Fort Hope, but they won't get here soon. He explained. Vanessa has already sent out a garrison we can use, I said. The Flame which had answered his letter and already had people on the way before we even took the city. Now that her war footing was winding down, she sent some of them up here rather than have them all stationed in the many forts she had built. Until they get here, I'll leave half the warriors here along with the wounded and most of the healers. I started making plans. The rest will march on Montreal with me. Is that wise? He asked. With so few, you risk them sallying out instead of letting you siege them. My eyes sharpened. Let them. I'll face them in the field any day rather than drag them out of their shell. To split our already outnumbered forces wasn't the smartest decision, but if it got them to face me head-on. I doubted they would be stupid enough to do so, but one could hope. By now, word had reached the entirety of New Canada, and they had all stockpiled food and provisions for a lengthy siege. We halted all trade coming in or out, but could do nothing about the stockpiles already in the city. The only good thing about officially laying siege was that they couldn't use their pylon shop. Given the size of the city and how many people were estimated to reside in Montreal, I knew their stores couldn't last long, but it would still be over a year at least. More if they rationed. While appetites grew the higher level you were, there were ways to mitigate it. Spatial enlargement of granaries would use warehouse space more efficiently. Cold and stasis formations could preserve food for longer than before. Higher-level grain and beasts were more nutritious, offsetting how much food needed to be stored. Starving them out was still a viable option, but it would still be slow. Slow and tedious. This time, we had already scouted ahead to see what the city was like and had a plan of approach in place. Whoever had built Montreal had not done as good a job as Ottawa. That made sense, as Ottawa was the capital, but I still expected more from the city. The formation and walls were weaker. The placement was less for defensibility and more for ease of use. It had rebuilt in the ruins of the old city, rather than move to somewhere easier to fortify. It also wasn't built with the idea that they would ever be attacked for some reason. Sure, there were stout walls and tall guard towers, but they did little to defend what lay underneath. Sapping them would take work, but it could be done. It was best to get started on that as soon as possible. The leaders of Montreal would either sally out and face me in the field, or we would tunnel under the walls and collapse them, dragging them out the hard way. Still, that didn't mean I could leave right away. Many needed rest after such a bloody battle, and I wasn't about to march off half-cocked. Sure, I wanted my low numbers to bait them out into the field, but I also didn't want it to be a sacrifice because of it. While we waited and recovered, there was still much to be done. I spent some of the day clearing debris, but most of my time was spent in the forge. D-rank blacksmiths weren't exactly rare, but D-rank blacksmiths who were willing to march with us were. It was rare to focus on both your class and profession. Most people focused on one or the other, making them closer to a primary and secondary rather than equals. There were many smiths among the army, but skilled ones were rarer. Skilled ones with a grade higher than uncommon, even more so. My epic profession wasn't solely dedicated to smithing, but it was more than enough to place me among the best of those we marched with. Vincent was the undisputed best smith in Frostheim, but he was back home. The backlog of repairs needed was so long that I was more than busy in the forge. Nearly every warrior needed either his weapon or armor repaired, my own included. Most needed both. It saw me another level in runesmith, but not much else. The work I was doing wasn't new or creative, only repair work on the metal and runes. Busy work, mostly. It was good for some essence, but I wouldn't see my skills growing anytime soon. It lacked the ingenuity and difficulty for that. It wasn't all bad. My time in the forge got me out of most of the headaches with ruling the city after we took it. I was thankful my sister was with us, because I wasn't sure I would have had the patience to deal with it all. Lakeshore had been difficult enough, and that was a city of just over 10,000. Ottawa was many times that in size. It took a month and a half, but we were ready to move on with just over 1,000 of our forces to set out for Montreal. Vanessa's garrison would arrive to relieve the rest soon enough, and they would join us for the inevitable next step. Ashton even called on his own forces in Fort Hope. I'd been wary of their loyalties at first, along with their ability to mesh into our existing forces, but those worries were put aside. We needed the numbers. We also called on an unlikely reserve that I had frankly forgotten about. I didn't have much hand in their creation or running, so they had honestly slipped my mind. Abigail had called on a small group of goalmancers, and they were making their way here with all due haste. It helped that their golems didn't tire as normal horses did. I hesitated when Abigail mentioned them because most were rather young, but I put those aside. The excuse I used to ease my conscience was that they were backline fighters and wouldn't be in the thick of things. Like that made a difference. Death was still death, and they would see much in the coming weeks. Chapter 430 Plan for Montreal. Alyssa Point of View. Location Road to Ottawa. She had been called. Finally. In all the time that she had been training, researching, and building, it was finally time for her to show her worth. To show everyone that she wasn't a waste. That she and her fellows were a force to be reckoned with, just like the other Oathbound. At first, it had been a bit disappointing to be so forgotten. Lady Abigail had spent so much time forming them into a force only to languish. But not anymore. No, it was finally their time. There were no more arguments about their age and how collectively young they were. With the rate they were tearing through the dungeons, there were no more arguments about their strength either. No. All the naysayers would see what was coming to them. Especially Rebecca. Just because she trained with Anna and the rest of the Shield Maidens didn't make them any better. You're thinking about Rebecca again. Jason tisked. He was riding beside her in their procession east with their line of golems marching behind them. He and the rest of the goalmancers, too. They were a sight, if she did say so herself. While their group may not be large in terms of human numbers, that was not the case when you included all of their golems. Alyssa, proudly, had the most with 17 under her control. 14 if she had them doing delicate or difficult tasks. Jason wasn't far behind with 15 under his control. The rest of the group had anywhere from 6 to 14, depending on how strong they were and how dedicated to training they were. Increasing the number under your control wasn't just a matter of having more levels or more skills. It took training, time, and most of all, skill with mana. Every order given had to be given through mana, and if you were poor with it, the golems themselves were poor. A fact they had realized early. "No, I'm not," Alyssa deflected. "Yes, you are. You have that face again," Jason laughed. She scowled. "See that one? I don't want to talk about her," she said curtly, but it only showed how right he was, not that she would ever admit that. Rebecca and her were rivals? No, not that strong, but they certainly got on each other's nerves. The woman took way too much pride in her skill with the silly spear. It was nothing like magic. Pointy sticks were nothing in the face of her jacks. It didn't help that Rebecca trained and was close with Lady Annabeth. That only made her more insufferable. Not that Anna was insufferable. She was usually easy to get along with and didn't carry the same arrogance. Changing the subject, Alyssa said, "What do you think he's like?" Jason looked over and met her eyes. "You would know more than I would. I haven't met him." "That doesn't count," Alyssa said. "It was years ago and for barely more than a few minutes. Still more than me." She remembered that meeting vividly. The presence, the power. It wasn't something she would ever forget. Nor would she forget how he just stood there, unarmored, and took her most powerful attack. It didn't even draw blood. She wondered if he could still do the same. For all the training and effort Alyssa had put in over the years, she knew he had done the same. The stories that were told sounded impossible, but she knew they were true. No one exaggerated when it came to Lord Christopher. His deeds were already impossible without the added exaggeration. "I don't even think he remembers me," Alyssa sighed. Jason smirked. "Then you just have to do something so he has no choice but to remember you." "Ha!" She snorted. Easier said than done. "Have you heard some of the stories they've been telling? He marched through smooth rock as none could touch him. St. Marie fell within days, and he killed the Lord of Shieldreach in single combat within a minute. I'd have to take Montreal by myself to even compare." Jason laughed. "You've been defending Frostheim damn near on your lonesome during the settlement waves. That's an achievement you should be proud of." Her cheeks reddened, and she turned away from him to look at the peaceful forest. With all of them announcing their presence, there weren't any beasts trying to bar their way. It made their journey peaceful, but dreadfully boring. Defending the waves is an entirely different matter than attacking a city. "You know this," she muttered, but was still proud of the praise. I do. Now that I've done it 4 times this year, defending Frostfall is routine at this point." Jason admitted. "It's what we were made for." Defending villages and cities was one of the main reasons their group was made and supported so heavily. The money and resources, not to mention the initial knowledge, weren't something Alyssa could pay back soon. If ever, but she would certainly try. The other reason, well, they were about to see how good they were at that in the coming weeks. Alyssa still held reservations, especially about the death toll that had been reported. But that wouldn't stop her from doing her duty. No, she'd face it head-on just like the Viscount. "Come, we need to get there before they decide to attack without us." Alyssa prodded her horse into a slow trot. "I hope we live up to their expectations." The road was rough and not nearly as well created as the one from Frostheim to Emberhold. It wasn't much better than trampled earth, to be honest, but with the army marching through, it was at least cleared of any obstacles. The earth mages had a habit of fixing the cracks and potholes while they walked. A welcome thing, considering the snowmelt wreaked havoc on dirt paths. By the time Montreal's walls came into view, it had been 2 months of rough travel. Still, the ride was faster than it had any right to be. The absence of wagons is the main reason. Who needed supply carriages when you could strap packs to golems? The rows of tents and wooden fortifications said that the army had been here for a few days, but by the way things were still being set up, they hadn't been here much longer than that. Good. We're right on time. They drew a few eyes, as they weren't the normal resupply caravan, but most turned away once they were recognized. Their golems weren't exactly inconspicuous, and many had seen them around Frostheim, or during the waves. The reactions of the Oathbound were varied, but most were glad to see them, a feeling she reciprocated. She was glad to finally be here as well. All it took was a word to one of the Oathbound, and they were directed to where they would stay. There was even a small space for them set aside for when they finally arrived, which included an area for their golems as well. Lady Abigail was thorough like that. She was also thoughtful like that. Alyssa set her golems to the task of unloading their cargo while the others did the same. There were some looks of jealousy at the fact that they had golems to set up camp rather than doing it themselves, and she smirked. Should have picked a different class. It wasn't long before a man arrived. One she knew well and had seen often. "Gavin," Alyssa greeted warmly. He looked well, all things considered. She'd feared the worst when they started getting reports of the losses and wounded, but he seemed to have gotten away mostly unscathed. There were new scars on his arms and hands, along with a small line along his cheek, but he seemed hale and healthy otherwise. "Alyssa, good to see that you are well," he greeted back. "You as well. How have things been?" she asked. Gavin hesitated. "Bloodier than I imagined." She nodded and took the warning for what it was worth. Monsters were one thing, humans were another. This would be many of her group's firsts. "Am I expected?" Alyssa said. "Yes," Gavin responded. "They're coming up with plans as we speak, and the capabilities of what you can accomplish need to be known." Alyssa waved over Jason and put him in charge of getting things settled while she followed Gavin towards the center of the army camp, towards the towering tent held up by thick pillars of ice, and the source of a frosty chill even in the summer heat. It was pleasant. It broke the worst of the inescapable sun. The closer she got, it turned less pleasant, harsher, colder, heavier, deadlier. Her body shivered instinctually. Yes, his presence does that of late. The war, it's taken a toll on him, Gavin said, choosing his words carefully. "Is he all right?" she asked. "As all right as can be expected," he said cryptically. "He gets worse after every battle. It eases with time, but..." He trailed off. "It doesn't ease enough before the next battle is at hand." As she looked around and felt some of the other veterans, there was the same sharpness and harshness to them. An edge that had been honed, leaving little room for softness or warmth. Battle-hardened, most would say. They walked the rest of the way in silence. The chill deepened, but it never became unbearable. Not like it had all those years ago when she'd first met him. Their levels were much closer now, but it was also because she had grown used to it. Everyone had. It was hard not to when such a presence was nearly constant while he was in Frostheim. It was chafing at first, but most grew to accept it. Some even felt comfort in it, like they were protected. Alyssa only felt determination. Determination to reach those heights. Determination that would soon be put to the test. Gavin parted the tent flaps and held them open for her to follow. Inside, she saw a collection of men and women surrounding a round table with a detailed map held down. It depicted a relatively circular city with each tower and gate marked, along with what the inside looked like. Street layout, building orientation, districts, guardhouses, stables. All of it was labeled. There were a few arrows drawn from different directions, with notes on soil type and stone stratification. Depths were marked. The north is too rocky and hard. It'll take weeks to get through and too much manpower. The softest target is the southwest. It's flat enough, soft enough, and can be completed in the quickest amount of time. A mage Alyssa didn't know said. By his robes and yellow gemmed staff, he was an earth mage. He also resonated with her own law. Heads turned when she and Gavin entered, and she was soon the center of attention of over a dozen people. Some she knew and some she didn't. The obvious ones are the Lord and Lady Abigail. She also recognized Hal and Sydney, as Gavin spoke of them often. Elliot too. The rest she wasn't sure of. She tried not to let her nervousness show. "Alyssa, thank you for coming," Lady Abigail said. "Everyone, this is Alyssa Sims. She leads the Golem creation and research team." She got varying looks with a few nods. She wasn't sure what she should say, so she just nodded back to everyone and stepped up to an open spot around the table. "I'm told you arrived with 248 golems? Is that number correct?" Lord Christopher gazed at her intently. She fought down a shudder. Yes, my lord, 248, though some are stronger than others. Tell me, how good of diggers are they? He asked. Well, not all of them are made from stone. She spoke slowly at first, but gained confidence since this was her field, a field she knew well. The golems reflect the affinity of the mage, so it varies. You can control golems of a different affinity, but they won't be as strong. Those made from ice or won't dig as well as those made from rock and stone. Plants dig well, and water isn't too bad, but prone to collapse. Most of the early work her team had was in construction, and most of that involved digging. If I were to ask you to, say, dig a tunnel over a dozen feet deep, over 1,000 feet long, how long would it take? He asked. Alyssa gazed down at the map and took in the details she needed. The composition, the topology, the angles. With me, Jason, Nadia, and Isaac, working in rotation. It depends, I haven't had a chance to feel it out yet, but based on what I can see, a few weeks. No more than 3 if all goes well. She answered. That caused him to smile. A wide smile that, for some reason, struck a fear inside her. Good. End of chapter 230.